Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to session number 1 of the Spring 2019 Community Building Institute. My name is Callie Foster, and I'm the Program Specialist for Montana Campus Compact, and I'll be your CBI host. This morning's session is on building community advisory groups, but before we get started with that, let's go over a few housekeeping items. CBI is a 2-week training series designed to help you create high-impact, community-driven programs and initiatives. Sessions will be held 3 times a week, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays at 11 a.m. Mountain Time, and will be accessible through a Zoom webinar link sent to your email each week. So this link that I sent out last week or this morning to you, this is the link you'll use every time we do CBI. Participants who complete all 6 seasons will be sent a certificate of completion. And to help us track attendance, please type your first and last name into the Zoom chat feature at the beginning of each session. For this session, please go ahead and do that now. Next, please draw your attention to the chat feature on your Zoom screen. Anytime you have a question during a session, please type it into the chat box. And finally, CBI is meant to be as engaging as possible. It takes your undivided attention and open mind to be successful. Please understand that what you put into CBI is a direct correlation to what you'll get out of this training. I ask you to please neglect your cell phones for this time and other work in order to soak in all this wonderful information. Okay, so now that we have all of that out of the way, it is my pleasure to introduce to you today's facilitator, Shannon Stover. Shannon Stover is one of Montana's premier leadership development facilitators, impacting hundreds of individuals each year through her various workshops, retreats, keynotes, and coaching engagements. Prior to founding her consulting firm, Verb Exchange, she served as the Director of Programs with the Montana Conservation Corps, Program Manager with the Montana Campus Compact, and Training Officer with the Governor's Office of Community Service. Shannon completed 2 terms of service as an AmeriCorps Vista and Vista Leader and earned her BA from Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. Thanks for being here with us this morning, Shannon.
You're welcome. Can you hear me? Callie, yes. Awesome. So hello, everybody. Welcome to webinar land. I know it's always a thrill to sit on a computer and get talked at. So my job is going to make this informative, fun, and hopefully eliminate as much pain as we possibly can. So thank you for that kind introduction, Callie. I do appreciate it. So as noted, my background in AmeriCorps is pretty significant. I moved to Montana in 2001 to enroll as a Vista with the Prevention Resource Center, and then spent roughly the next 15 years working on staff with AmeriCorps programs around the state. I now own my own company. It's called Verb Exchange, and I am a community building entrepreneur. So I work all over the state and nationally with different service entities, nonprofit organizations, public entities, doing leadership development, strategic planning, program development, things of the like. I'm a junkie for AmeriCorps. You're going to see more of me this year than you probably desire, but it gives me joy, and hopefully it'll give you a little bit of joy as well. Also formerly am the chair of the AmeriCorps alumni chapter here in Montana, so you're going to be seeing me past your term of service too. So that's just a little bit about me. Community Building Institute, Community Building Webinar Series. I just want to give a plug to this real quick before we jump into my content for today. So I was introduced to the community building lifecycle when I was a Vista, much like most of you who are on today's webinar. And it took me quite a while to really understand the power of this model and to really begin to wrap my head around the notion that community building is a process. It's sequential. There are right and wrong ways to do it. I can talk to you now, having worked with this model for about 15 years. It is actually very advanced. It might feel kind of easy to understand on the surface, but the more you use it, the more you play with it, and the more you bring it into your service, into your work moving forward, the more you'll recognize what a powerful theory it is. And yeah, it's something that a lot of people in the nonprofit sector and the public sector aren't really aware of. So I just encourage you to, as Callie mentioned, try and engage with this content, do additional research, ask questions, figure out how it applies to your project. I guarantee you it applies to every single one of your projects because this is going to be a powerful tool for you moving forward. Okay, so community building life cycle always revolves around community need, and in other sessions, you're gonna get information about how to assess that need and how to raise awareness about that need. But today, we are gonna be talking about community advisory groups, which is technically step 3 within the process. As we move forward, if you're working on developing a community advisory group, I encourage you, once you're completed with this webinar series, to make sure step 1 and 2 have been done before you go much further with step 3. But today we're focusing on step 3. So community advisory groups, let me give you a little street cred before we get going. I always like to know if the person talking to me about a certain subject actually knows anything about it and has any credibility. So a couple of things that I'm involved with or have been involved with that kind of give me some practical knowledge on this subject. So I've served on several boards of directors. I currently serve on the board for the Montana Higher Ed Student Assistance Corporation. I also just lost my screen. There we go. Serve on the Reach Higher Montana Advisory Council. I served on the steering committee for the Big Sky Watershed Corps, which is another AmeriCorps program here in Montana. I served on the Interagency Committee for Change by Women when I was working in the governor's office. I served on the Helena Youth Advisory Council, the AmeriCorps Member Advisory Council, and then obviously the most important one on this list, the Bozeman Dog Park Task Force, right? So when we were trying to figure out if we need to leash our dogs up and who's picking up poop, that was very important work. That I was on that committee. And then I've also done some work with the Employee Charitable Giving Campaign. So as you'll come to find out, these are all different models of advisory councils, and we'll explore it. But just in case you were wondering if I really know anything about the subject, I do have some experience. What I know, you guys could determine as we move forward, but I've done a little bit of this stuff. All right, so what do we want to get out of today? Got a handful of outcomes. This is what we're aiming for. First, want to explore the importance of advisory groups. Next, define and characterize the various different group models that exist, because you're going to hear a lot of interchangeable language. We're going to identify common pitfalls for advisory groups, identify best practices for advisory groups, and then we'll wrap up with just some tips around how you can execute your work with community advisory groups as a national service member. So that's what I'm hoping to accomplish. We're going to pack a lot in, so pay attention. Okay. So we're going to be using the chat box here and there just to get input from you and your feedback. And so I know folks were putting their name in there, but we're going to go ahead and test it one more time just to make sure my visual on it is good. So we're going to start with a riddle, right? Riddle me this. Throw away the outside and cook the inside, then eat the outside and then throw away the inside. What is it? So you're gonna put your guess in the chat box. And I'm gonna wait till I get a few. We'll be just holding on this point till we get some good guesses, maybe even correct answer. So throw away the outside and cook the inside, then eat the outside and throw away the inside. What is it? Who would like to guess? Put your guess in the chat box. Oh no, you didn't see that. You guys don't know what it was. These things are so touchy. No kid, fried chicken. I'm going with, I like Claire. Hi Claire. An egg. All right, Callie, you only sent that to me, by the way. We've got corn, chicken, and egg. What other guesses might exist? There's a couple that are actually right, other than the one that I have. A potato. Everett says a potato. Yes, perhaps it's a potato. Let's get like 1 or 2 more guesses. Chicken, corn, eggs, potatoes. What else? A banana. See, banana is the one that usually comes up. So those of you who are paying attention will see that this little graphic just showed up. It's corn. And that's some freaky corn. So we're going to go ahead and shoot that dude off away. But that just means your chat box are working and I can read it. And hopefully we won't have any more PowerPoint glitches. Okay, so let's jump into some content. So what is a community advisory group? In front of us, we have just kind of this basic definition. A group of community members pulled together to advise your organization or initiative by looking at the problem, coming up with some ideas about what can be done about it, and creating and implementing an action plan to move forward. As you get more familiar with the community building life cycle, you'll recognize that they really are the ones who are bringing you through that last part of the cycle. So we understand this, but what's the actual value? For me, when I think about working with community groups, really what we're talking about is these are the folks that are your guides, right? This is your guide on the side, the people who are going to ensure that everything you're doing is in touch with the needs of the community you're serving. They have their finger on the pulse, can tell you about what's changing, what's landing, what's working in the community. As Vistas specifically, we recognize that a huge part of your job is to address community need and empower the community need, and you really just can't do that unless you're working with the community directly. So some activities these folks undertake, they provide guidance and insight, right, which we mentioned. They also provide support for long-term visioning, similar to some other entities we'll talk about in a second, but they can also help with day-to-day work, right? So these folks aren't just about giving you input and information, they're also there to help kind of carry the load with you. And like I said, the most important thing here is that they ensure that the work that we're doing is aligned with the community need, and that creates ownership and ultimately sustainability. So some of you may have seen this before. This is an old community organizing model from like the 60s. And essentially what we have in front of us is recognizing what it takes to create community ownership or citizen power. Oftentimes when we talk about sustainability, we really only talk about that in the lens of funding. But the reality is that sustainability has as much, if not more, to do than with the community owning the work than how much money you're going to have. When the community owns the work, the money comes, okay? So what this model shows us is that traditionally when we're engaging with community members, we do these non-participatory strategies, right? So we're treating them as beneficiaries, we're delivering them service, we might be placating their needs, and you'll see as we come up that ladder, occasionally we're informing, we're actually talking to them. When we're working with advisory groups, we start to move into those high levels of citizen power. So truly, the best advisory groups, we're consulting. It's a two-way conversation. We're sharing what we're working on. They're giving us information to help us. When we consult, we can actually start to work in partnership. And when we have that partnership, people begin leading themselves, and that's when we delegate power, okay? So when we're talking about working with advisory groups, it's important to me that you understand that this is really the soil of sustainability, and that's probably one of the most important things that you're going to be doing in Montana as a Vista. And for those of you who are on here that aren't Vistas, I know you're working on capacity building and community development as well. So just keep it in mind. It's not just about what they're doing for us. This is a huge strategy to changing communities. Okay. Chat box again. So in front of you, we've got 5 different entities, and I want for you to tell me which of these is not an advisory group. So we have a steering committee, advisory council, board of directors, coordinating council, and task force. So go ahead and pick which of those you think is not an advisory group and put your guess in the chat. All right, you've got task force, board of directors, another vote for our board, steering committee, task force. We've got another one for board of directors, a few more task forces, more task forces. Task force is on the out. It must have been the story I told you about the dog park. Anything else? Any other guesses? Quite a few for task force, a few for the board of directors. Coordinating council, I like that, from AmeriCorps to everyone. I don't know who is logged in as AmeriCorps, but I love it. Cool. So here's the deal, trick question. All right, trick question, which you probably saw, but the reality is all of these entities technically represent an advisory group in one capacity or another. A lot of times I see service members who are like, well, I'm not working with an advisory group because it's not being explicitly called an advisory group. But again, an advisory group is any gathering of community members that have come together to support our work, right? So board of directors, this is the most formal one, right? So we know if you're working for a nonprofit entity, you're legally required to have a board of directors in place. These are the governing entities. They have what's known as fiduciary responsibility. So they are making sure that finances are in order, that all the laws are being obeyed, that the executive director is performing well. Depending on the size of the nonprofit you're working with, you may have a huge formal board of directors, or you might have a very small board of directors who have been doing all the work the entire time the organization has been in existence. So that's why I think it's important that we name those folks too. Next, steering committees. So steering committees are oftentimes multiple organizations who have come together and are pooling their money for one specific project or program they're doing jointly. So I mentioned that I was on the steering committee for the Big Sky Watershed Corps. In that particular instance, you have the Montana Conservation Corps, what was used to be called the Association of Conservation Districts, and then the Watershed Coordinating Council, pooling money together, pooling resources, sharing resources to implement a project. So steering committees are generally, again, just a step down from that level of formality as a board of directors. Coordinating councils tend to be when we have lots of organizations or stakeholders who are engaged in something coming together at the table and sharing information, talking about here's the strategy, here's what we're doing for hunger in our community, here's what you're doing for education, how are we working together? So this is about sharing practices and being kind of strategic in your work. Advisory councils are generally groups that we say, hey, you know what, we want to start a new initiative, or we are working on housing issues in this community and we need local developers and neighborhood representation to come in and give us information to inform our work. And then a task force tends to be a short-term, sort of high energy, high focus group that comes together to accomplish a very specific goal. So those are all examples of the different models that you might see and that you may be working with. But I guarantee you, each and every one of you has some kind of contact with an entity that falls into one of these categories. And even if your job isn't to construct that, anything we cover today is going to be of value for you in terms of understanding how to interact with them. So I would say thumbs up, are we all on board? But most of you don't have your cameras on, so I'm going to assume you're giving me a thumbs up back. Thanks. All right, next slide. The important thing to remember about any of these groups that we're talking about is these folks are volunteers, and that often gets lost. You hear people complain sometimes at boards, oh, the board didn't do this or the task force isn't doing that. But the reality is that all of these people are technically volunteers, and when we put it in that light, they're not just volunteers, they're superstar volunteers. I mention it to say there are so many resources out there on volunteer management, and we're not going to get into that today. But if you're not fluent in volunteer management, if volunteer management is something that's new for you, I really encourage you to do some resources, do those resources, do some research and find some resources to better understand the field of volunteer management, because all of that is going to apply to working with your councils. All right, let's start. So this is one of my favorite questions. We're going to start jumping into how we effectively integrate and work with our advisory groups. So let's start with why it doesn't work. So in the chat box, I'm looking for your answers. What, in your experience, contributes to the failure of a group that's trying to work together? What are those common pitfalls? So you can use any example in your life. You can think about working at a job. If you just come from school, you can think about the dreaded group projects, things that you've experienced professionally. But what are those things? Communication issues, doubling up on that. Miscommunication, lack of a leader or point person, good. What else? What contributes? Poor leadership, lack of leadership. Yes, one-track mind, not open to other ideas. That stuff is for real. Not willing to compromise. We've got some more on the communication. Lack of direction is huge. Another vote for lack of direction. What are some other things that contribute to the pitfalls of working with a group that make that experience go poorly? Not listening, absolutely. Burnout when the process is long-term, yes. Skills not being utilized. Unclear expectations, no delegation, little commitment, lack of organization, poor communication. Volunteers are stretched too thin, no defined roles, no clear understanding, agendas, different agendas, right? Not like paper agendas, but like we all got our agendas. Awesome. So here's the deal is I believe that generally speaking, we all have a good intuitive sense of how to do these things well. We just don't recognize that that intuitive sense is often stemming from bad experiences that we've had in the past. So for me, always bring that to the front of your mind and we'll start there. All right, great responses. We've all had these experiences. Next question. So based on what we just kind of generated there, which of these following 4 items will cause the most dysfunction within your advisory group? So A, a poor structure, B, poor group dynamics, C, interpersonal issues, or D, individual member issues. So go ahead and guess. We've got an A, couple A's, all of the above, all, interpersonal. We've got some A's, all, I would say all, A. Let's get a couple more. There's more of you out there. A and B. Another trick question. Everett, this one is not a trick, I promise. A and B. Say all, A. Okay, so here's the deal, and watch this. This slide's fancy. Uh-oh, wait for it. Curtains moving. So this model here is called the waterline model. It was created in the 70s by a group of researchers who came together to better understand the sources of workplace conflict. And the way that conflict was described in that study was task disruption, so like things just aren't getting done, and disharmony. The relationships aren't in play. Okay, so what they identified is that there are 4 contextual areas that will create conflict in the workplace. Okay, so structure, group dynamics, interpersonal, and intrapersonal, right? That one person's issues. What they found is 80% of the time that conflict was stemming from poor structure and bad group dynamics, But what was interesting about it is that more than 80% of the time, the people who were experiencing the conflict were attributing it to something interpersonal or personal. So think about that for yourself. When we go, oh, these poor experiences, past experiences working with groups, why didn't things go well? Well, so many of you are like, oh, it's the communication or hidden agendas, right? So we're going straight to that interpersonal and intrapersonal zone. But what we know is it's actually usually about structure and somebody not being attentive to group dynamics. So we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about how we can use this information to create good structural components for whatever community group we're working with, and then think critically about how we can take the lead on creating healthy dynamics. So not really a trick question, but a cool piece of information if you ask me, but I'm kind of geeky about this stuff. All right, so let's start with structure. So the first piece of structure that you want to give your attention to is purpose. I can't tell you how many times I have seen people create a steering committee or an advisory group or whatever you might do with zero purpose, with zero need, right? If you don't have a clear purpose, if you cannot clearly articulate the reason for the group, the reason you're bringing people together, then you don't need a group. I'm going to say that one more time because some people think, oh, well, we don't have an advisory group, so let's put one together. No, if you don't have a purpose, you don't need them. You should have some kind of purpose, but if you can't articulate it, you're not ready to start yet. So first and foremost, be very, very clear on why you're pulling people together. As we all know, there's nothing worse than being a volunteer who shows up and doesn't have anything to do. Once you've clearly identified purpose, then you want to create an actual purpose statement. And this is important to conceptualize it and put it on paper because it's going to ground all the other structural tools that you develop. Writing a purpose statement is different than your mission. It's not the mission of your organization, but it should be closely tied to your mission. So for example, when I was with the Montana Conservation Corps, we identified a need to have alumni of that program coming together to support our gathering and work with bringing additional alumni into the fold to carry that mission forward outside of the parameters of our direct program. So for us, with an MCC, it's like, well, we're all about creating engaged citizens and leaders who are stewards of the land, right? So it's like, okay, well, what's our purpose statement here? To engage alumni in continual leadership and civic engagement, right? So it's different, it's a clear purpose, but it's directly tied to our mission. Once you've figured out what your purpose is in your purpose statement, then you can identify what the structure is. So again, the MCC example, we need alumni. We want to mobilize our alumni and sort of utilize that huge cohort of people to move our mission forward. And what we needed specifically was insight on the best ways to engage alumni and reach them. So for us, that was an advisory council, right? We needed their advice. We needed them to continually advise our efforts. So we decided we'll have an advisory plan. The last piece is to identify your goals, right? Identify your goals, and I say it's important to have them, but you don't want to refine them too much. If you overly refine your goals, you don't give room for the members of your advisory council to inform it for themselves. So we'll use the MCC example again. It was like our goals are, we are going to identify 4 strategies that have the best, option of reaching our alumni. We didn't tell them what the strategies were. We didn't ratchet it down so tightly that they didn't have a voice in it, but we knew what our objectives were, okay? Purpose. Make sure you have one, clearly state it, let that lead whatever model that you decide to use, and rough out some goals so people know where you're headed. Okay. Next, your roles and responsibilities, okay? So for me, one thing I notice is when we work with volunteers, we just throw all of our human resource practices out the window. Never do we give volunteers position descriptions, and we should. I always like to tell people, would you ever advertise for an employee with just a sign that said employee wanted? No, right? You're like, this is who we're looking for, this is the responsibilities they're gonna have, and all of that manifests in a position description. So all of your members of your advisory groups should actually have a position description that they're working under. That is your tool of structure, communication, creating clear expectations. I think quality position descriptions include sort of the purpose of the group, a very big picture, here's the responsibility, here's what each individual does, and then as well as expectations for things like attendance, communication, things of that sort. So that's an easy Google. If you've never written a position description and you're running with a board that doesn't have one or a committee that doesn't have one, put that in the Google machine, put those together. Position descriptions are one half of it. The next piece is actually developing resources for your group members. So I've served on quite a few boards and advisory councils, and there have been plenty of times where I have shown up and it's like, there's no resources, there's no manual, there's no documentation of what we're working on or tools to help me better understand the mission. If you want your advisory group to really thrive, you need to actually resource them. We're going to talk later about the importance of developing competency, but if you're not providing them with clear, updated, oftentimes written materials to work with to better understand their role, you're not going to get the performance from them that you want. And then finally, you should develop draft calendars and timelines. A lot of times we try and do that on the fly and just set meetings after each other meeting has occurred, and that works to a point. But when we're talking about structure, being able to say things like, we meet quarterly, we're going to be meeting in these months this year, here's what we're doing in between, just that level of information answers questions and helps people develop clear expectations. Okay. The next piece to think about structurally is staffing. So we've got our purpose, we've got roles and responsibilities for our members. Now we have to think about staffing. And this is where I see a lot of organizations run into problems because they don't take the time to think critically and clearly about what the staffing for that advisory group looks like. So first and foremost, staff roles should be clear internally. If you have an advisory group, if you have a board, that you have some kind of access to, everybody involved in your organization should sit down and be very clear on what their roles are with that entity. So that clarity begins with you. Once you've done that, your advisory group needs to know who their key support staff members are, and that should be stated very clearly. Like, take your questions to Marissa or send that information to Dan and he'll get back to you. Leaving it nebulous and having people communicate with different staff members at different times creates so much unnecessary chaos. So make sure that you're clear with your members who their staff point person is. If you are somebody who has been designated as a key support player for your advisory group, I highly recommend that you put space and time aside every single week to check in and think about what you're doing for that group. It is very easy to only reach out to them when you need something, to only reach out to them right before there's a meeting. And a big part of what we're doing with these volunteers is developing relationships. So whoever has that staff assignment should prioritize, like even if it's just sending a check-in email, which we'll talk more about later, but just make sure that you have time set aside every single week to continually prioritize that. It's really easy to sort of push this to the side and consider it not urgent when it is. And then the final piece is that the staff, when you say, hey, this is my job, that's your role, I'm the point person, here's the time I have allocated every week, internally, people really, really need to honor the agreements that have been made about that. Not uncommon at all for that stuff to be clear as day, but all of a sudden there's a board member who's calling Judy from the food bank because they're friends and now everything got confusing. Or the executive director decided to jump in and weigh in with their 2 cents, and now that person who is communicating is unclear on who their support staff is. So just make sure that you guys are adhering to the agreements that you've made. You're having conversations that you might need to have behind closed doors, but that for your council, they're seeing the same people and communicating with the same people. Very important. Okay. Last piece for structure, orientation, right? So again, these are these simple things that we think we understand or that we think maybe, oh, I sent that email and it was enough, and oftentimes it's not. So when we're bringing on volunteers, when we're bringing on superstar volunteers that are going to be serving in a group capacity and informing our work and supporting our work, it's really, really important that we give them a proper orientation. If folks here aren't familiar with the Models of Situational Leadership by Ken Blanchard, that's another one that I would encourage you to put into your Google machine, because Ken Blanchard does great work in helping us understand what it takes to actually develop commitment and competency in the folks that are working with us. And we understand when somebody is entering a new position or a new organization, we have to be super directive and front load as much information as we can. So appropriate orientations are really put as much energy as you can there. That's your investment. If you don't do it up front, you're going to have to do it down the road and it's going to feel messier. So things that you want to make sure you include in your orientation: overview, mission, vision, purpose. Everything we've just talked about, we're filling in that big picture lens for our volunteers. Next, that overview of roles and responsibilities. So hopefully you talked about that when you were recruiting. Hopefully whoever has come into your entity has a copy of that position description, but it is something that you do want to verbalize and have an opportunity for people to ask questions in person just to make sure it's solidified. We talked about you want to have resources for your members, draft calendars, again, review all of that in person. And then finally, team building. And you're going to hear me talk about this more. There's people in the world who are like, I don't need team building. I'm too good for team building. And like, no, man, that's not true. Like, ice breaking and team building is evidence-based. And we understand that we're bringing those relational methodologies to our group work. We increase production significantly. I'm going to hit on that a couple of times, but during your orientation, team build. I have served on boards where I walked in and I didn't know everybody's names until 8 months in because we never did any team building. So just recognize they're volunteers and that relational component matters. So you need to make sure you hit it up front. Structure. Last piece, accountability. So this is where we often fall short. I think sometimes when we're working with volunteers, we have a belief that because they're volunteers, it means that we can't really hold them accountable and we have to just sort of accept what they're willing to give us. And that's not true. And that mentality creates a lot of problems in nonprofit organizations. One thing I like to say a lot is that it's better to have an empty seat than the wrong person in that seat. So accountability is important. It's something you have to be thinking about up front with your advisory group members. So again, create clear participation expectations. That should be in your position description. That should be something that's talked about in orientation. Let people know what participation looks like for you, what the minimum amount of participation is. Next, do the same thing for communication, right? So, hey, if you're on this and we send you this and, we're going to ask you to respond within a week and we expect that you're going to respond within a week. So just letting people know what that looks like for them. When you're telling them about those expectations, it's also good to say, and then, name the consequences up front. If you miss more than 2 meetings, we might check in with you to see if there's a better fit as a different volunteer in our organization. Or if you're not responding to communications on a regular basis, we're going to check in with you and maybe explore if this isn't a good fit for you. So just let people know that you mean business. Like, hey, just because you're a volunteer doesn't mean that you don't have to be accountable to the work that we're doing. Nip that inappropriate behavior quickly. So if you've named what you expect, you've told them what the consequences are, and if you see it starts seeping in, jump on it right away. Don't wait until it's turned into a 1.5 year long pattern that now the entire group has followed because nobody was holding anybody accountable. Address it right out of the gate. And then most importantly, follow the rules yourself, right? Model the desired behavior. Like if you want people to respond to you in a certain amount of time, then you need to make sure you're responding in that amount of time. If you say this is what healthy participation looks like, then you need to model that to others well. All right. Stay with me, folks. We're getting there. Not tons of time left. We're going to keep plowing through. Now we're going to talk about dynamics. That's that second bucket. So again, remember that conflict often arises from poor structure and poor dynamics. So let's talk a little bit about how we create healthy dynamics with our groups. All right. So one thing that I think people don't put enough thought into is the fact that our dynamics actually begin at our recruitment, right? So that's when we start thinking about dynamics for our group, is when we're recruiting for our group. Oftentimes when we're recruiting for community groups, advisory groups, boards of directors, we'll create a skills matrix, right? And I encourage people to do that, to think critically, like, what types of neighborhoods do I want represented? What age groups do I want represented? What kind of diverse backgrounds, educational levels, political views, like who do I want represented in this group? And think about how that is going to create dynamics. So just begin there, thinking about the ideal dynamics, the ideal representation that you'll have on that group, and start thinking from that position. When we talk about issues with dynamics with groups, a lot of times it's some of the structural things that we just covered. What I mean by that is we weren't clear around expectations, we're not clear about consequences, so we have people coming in maybe not really knowing that they were going to be expected to do as much, or not clear on what they were expected to do. So again, during that recruitment phase, share that position description. Make sure people are very clear up front. Don't bring them in until they have total clarity around what they're doing and have agreed to do it. I think it's important to interview potential candidates for advisory groups. Sometimes we just take the nomination. We're like, cool, I have a seat at the table, put your butt in it. And again, that never works out well. So make sure that you are interviewing and finding out, like, what about their background is relevant, what's making them interested in the position, and what level of commitment they can give you. And when you're doing those interviews, ask those people about their personal goals as well. If I understand what you're looking to gain through this experience, if I've asked that question directly, there's a real good chance I'll be able to help you meet that need that you're coming to find and get filled. But if I never ask you, the likelihood of me meeting your need is pretty low. So just remember, it starts with recruitment. Communication, here we go. This one came up a whole lot, so we'll touch on it briefly. It is a structural piece, but it also is a dynamics piece. So my tips for you in terms of thinking through communication and how that's going to come to light with your advisory group. First of all, ensure that your communication is accessible. And this is really, really important, right? Each and every one of us communicates in the way that we feel most comfortable and that feels natural to us. And oftentimes we're overlooking other people. So this is going to come up in a big way when we're looking at generational work. So for example, if you are young, fresh out of college, super comfortable with social media and technology, and you're like, well, we're going to just all communicate on like WhatsApp. But then you have people who maybe like me are like in my 40s now, and I'm like, wait, how do I use that? What happens with that, right? Like you have to be thinking about that level of accessibility. Another thing in the state of Montana in particular, some of our tribal communities and our rural communities don't actually have great internet, right? Like there are those places that we're still serving that the internet isn't good. So if everything's online, that might not work well. Or if you're working with a senior, not even seniors now because they're Facebooking too, but a truly elderly population, like they're not going to be going online. So you have to think about that. Is this accessible? Next, going back to the idea of identifying a key staff person and making sure that they're setting aside time each week. A big part of that is for them to make sure that they're communicating with the members. So I like to say you should be communicating consistently, reliably, and cleanly. So consistently just means regularly and predictably, right? People know they're going to hear from you. You don't just communicate when you need something. You don't just communicate 24 hours before a meeting. You're staying in touch. You're keeping those channels of communication open. Reliably means that you're doing so in the same way, right? So sometimes one of the things that irritates me is like, oh, well, this time we loaded it to Google Drive, but this time it was the email, but this other time it was on a Facebook message. And it's like, you have to just make sure it's reliable so people know when to expect it and how to expect it. And then cleanly just means, are you using good, just basic professional standards of communication? Are you bulleting? Are you making sure the most important information is relevant? Are you being sure to eliminate, details that are just going to confuse people? So make sure you're communicating cleanly as well. Okay, so it's accessible. We're doing it consistently. We're reliable about it, and it's clean. I often recommend that people utilize email and file sharing systems. So what I mean by that is boards that I serve on right now that I feel like are doing this well. If there's a document that needs to be reviewed or considered, they'll send that to me in an email, but I also know that that document has been uploaded into Google Drive where we have all of our shared documents stored. Having both and not maintaining them both is a bad thing, so make sure you have them both and that you're maintaining both of them. And it's just a nice way for folks to have access to information, and it gives you tools for accountability. So when people say things like, I didn't see it, I didn't get it, you're like, well, it's in both locations. So doubling up is good. I'm a big believer of utilizing online calendars. So I think people in really good, well-intended positions will send out draft calendars that are finished in a PDF or a Word document. But as we all know, calendars change. Those things change all the time. And so when we're just constantly sending out new versions of calendars, all we're doing is breeding confusion with the people that we're trying to coordinate. And again, remember, they're volunteers. We want to make this as easy as possible. So I recommend utilizing online calendars that everybody has access to. So there's always one version of that. There's not multiple, there's just one, and we know it's up to date. I also think it's important with these folks, again, we want to make it easy to send them calendar invites. So if that's not something that you do, look into it. But for me, if I'm going to make an appointment with you, I'm going to send you a calendar invite to make sure that that gets calendared on both of our systems the exact same way. And then finally, don't be afraid to pick up the phone, right? So everything we're talking about here is electronic. Like send your emails, use your online calendars, make sure you're using file sharing, but don't be afraid to pick up the phone. So if you're not hearing back from somebody, if you have a question, if you just want to check in to see how things are going, pick up the phone. The big thing to remember with that is if you make a decision, if you make a commitment, if you've given somebody feedback that you're going to hold them accountable to, make sure that you also follow up in writing. So don't fear the phone. The phone is fine. We can do it. Sometimes I answer mine too. But just make sure that you're using it and following up if you've had a conversation to make sure things are documented. Okay. Meetings. So the reality is that all of these entities are showing up and doing the bulk of their work in a meeting format, right? And so it seems like a small thing to discuss. It seems kind of funny, but actually I don't even have enough time to tell you as much as I would like to about effective meetings, especially with volunteers. So just a couple tips for you to be thinking about in terms of how are we using meetings. First and foremost, utilize a meeting scheduler. If folks haven't been out there, the one that I prefer to use is called Doodle. It's a doodle poll where you can go in and put in a bunch of options of dates and times, and then you can send that out to everybody who needs to respond. They go, let you know when you're available. You just look at it and see which days people are available or the right people are available, however you make that decision, and you just do it that way, right? That makes that clean, that makes that easy, it makes it easier to track. And not as frustrating for folks when they're like reading through lines and lines of responses about when something's going to happen. So if you're not utilizing a meeting scheduler yet, please do. Next, think through agendas, right? So a lot of times we think, well, I'll build an agenda and then I'll just show up with this agenda and it will be fine. And actually, we're not supporting the uploading and the empowerment of our group when we're just telling them what meetings are going to look like. So my personal practice is this. I like to send out draft agendas and any resources that go along with that agenda 1 week prior to the meeting, right? So it's a week ahead of time. Hey, folks, here's the draft. Here's the resources we're going to use. And then I always make the invitation of, let me know if you have questions or concerns, things that you would like added, right? So giving people at least the opportunity, if they choose to have say on what that meeting's going to look like and what's going to be covered. So I give about 5 days for folks to process that and give me input if they'd like to, and then I send the final stuff out 48 hours in advance. This is important because I'm sure you've all experienced, it's pretty common to be sitting in a room and somebody says like, well, I didn't know we were talking about this, or why aren't we talking about this other thing? And this is a way to really make sure you're maximizing your time, saying, actually, it went out, nobody gave me feedback, this is what we're doing today. If that's something you need to discuss, let's go ahead and get it on our next agenda. So just giving people that information ahead of time and time to respond really is extremely helpful in making sure that the behaviors and the energy in the room are what we want. Recording during meetings, right? It can get hard when people haven't recorded meetings a lot. I see them trying to write down verbatim every word that comes out of people's mouths. The reality is what you really need to focus on are action steps and decisions. So if somebody says, well, I'll do that, or, okay, so we've made this decision, we're moving forward, that's what you really, really want to focus on capturing. That's the important stuff, and that's the stuff that you're going to reflect back to and be holding people accountable to. So make sure that you're documenting that stuff in particular, and if not you, if not you specifically, make sure somebody in the room is. That should be a concrete role, and it should be named at the beginning of the meeting, like who's recording and what they're recording. When you do that, before you end the meeting, whoever is recording and has documented action steps and decisions should read that back to the group, right? Super simple little thing that I see overlooked all the time that has a huge impact, right? So at the end of the meeting, it's like, okay, so let's just be clear. Don said that he was going to make that phone call, and it sounds like Doug and Carly are going to go ahead and do that outreach, and I'm going to follow up with all of you. Make sure everybody hears it out loud. Are there any questions? Is there anything that has been missed? And get that confirmation before you leave the room. So again, we recognize a big part of what makes working with groups sometimes troublesome is that in between meetings, nothing's getting done. And this is your tool to hold people accountable. We recognize that we're here to actually do some lifting and do some work as well. I like to make sure those minutes go out within 72 hours, right? Within 3 days, you want to get your minutes out to whoever was there. The turnaround on that matters. I've had people wait weeks to months sometimes to send documentation from a meeting, and at that point, it's like the last thing in my brain. So I encourage you to send out any minutes that you have within 72 hours. My personal preference is to attach the minutes to an email, and then those action items that I mentioned that we went through at the end of the meeting, to paste that in the body of the email so that folks have it right in front of them. So that's kind of my personal approach to using structure in meetings to maintain dynamics and give you tools for accountability. Obviously, all of this is also dependent upon effective facilitation. So if in your service position, you are being asked to facilitate, and when I say facilitate, you're in front of the room, making it easy, pulling that group along, moving from point A to point B. If that's not something you have experience with or information on, really encourage you to do some research on that and potentially see if you can get some training I think facilitation is one of the strongest skills I got during my national service experience. And it's not something that everybody does naturally, and there are absolute right ways to do it. So if you're not familiar with facilitation, but it's something that you're accountable to, see if you can find some more tools. All right, we're almost there. You guys are doing good. Member engagement, right? So we talk about dynamics, member engagement. You got to remember that when you pull these people together for meetings, when you take their time, it is about them. It is not about you, right? When we're working with community groups, we're doing so for guidance, for information, for support, for community leadership, and that is about them. So if you're holding an advisory committee meeting and you spend the entire time talking at them, that is about you, that is not about them. So you always need to lead with that. Like, when I'm bringing these people together, when I'm engaging them, how am I making this about them? What can I do to make sure they're heard, they're participating, and they feel like this is centered around them? I said it before, and I'm going to say it again. Utilize icebreakers and team building activities, right? Like, I always kind of giggle a little bit by people who are like, pish posh, icebreakers, ma. One thing I say often is, there's two things. You can either, be too cool to do an icebreaker, or, like, what, you can't be too cool to do an icebreaker. It's fine. You one way or another, you're going to be silly. You're going to be silly doing the icebreaker. You're going to be silly because you choose not to. So bring those to your group. And again, research it. There's good evidence that says when we break the ice, even with groups that we have worked with for many, many years, production goes up, attention goes up. Use those things. Remember that volunteers are oftentimes driven by relational needs. Send regular updates and feel-good stories. So again, don't always just reach out with like, here's our agenda, here's the decision we want you to make. Make sure they are getting to experience your mission and the work that your organization is accomplishing, and the benefits to the community and the people you're serving as much as you do. That stuff motivates all of us. Don't be afraid to invite members to participate in other events and activities. So if you've got an advisory council, invite them to a fundraiser, invite them to a volunteer service day. If you're doing a public meeting, have them come and observe and participate if they'd like to. Just make sure they feel like they have the opportunity to be included if it's something they want to do. Also, introduce them to other stakeholders. So if you've got people on an advisory group, introduce them to other staff members, introduce them to your board of directors if we're not talking about your board of directors right now. Let them meet your funders, put them out there, make them feel included. Send specific and meaningful thank yous. So again, recognize that people serving in these entities are volunteers, and they're superstar volunteers at that. And so recognition is going to be really, really important. And good recognition isn't just, hey, good job. Right? Recognition is, I want you to know we appreciate you doing this thing on this day, and I'm not sure how we would be able to move forward if it wasn't for somebody like you. Thank you cards, handwritten ones, money, man. People love handwritten thank you cards. If you can give people a little gift certificate, like the little Dairy Queen coupons, do those things too. It matters for folks. Don't be afraid to recognize those people publicly either. So put a letter in the newspaper, do whatever you can to let folks know that you've got a great team of volunteers who are supporting you. And when we're doing all this, when we're including them and bringing them into the fold, giving them introductions, making sure they understand that we have gratitude, that's how we start cultivating them for additional responsibility. So a great example of that, it's not uncommon to have somebody who's a volunteer, who then becomes a member of an advisory group, who is then promoted to the board of directors. So just again, back to that ladder of civic participation, just recognize that you can actually do that, and a big part of it is that member engagement, which is oftentimes around gratitude. All right. So AmeriCorps members, I just gave you guys the fire hose of information around advisory councils. So I want to hear from you. Let's kind of put the mic back in your hand, the chat box in your hand, if you will. Why is working with community groups that much more important for people who are in service in AmeriCorps? So I want to see your responses over here in the chat box. Why is engaging and connecting with community groups really, really important for people who are serving in AmeriCorps? Building capacity with the big exclamation point. Yes, absolutely. Building capacity, right? We're just visitors in these communities. We're not here. We're visiting. What else? Locals have a better understanding of community needs. Amen, right? Like, this is a thing we find, it's hard. And I remember when I was at Vista, we lead with solutions. We come in, we get excited. We're like, just do this thing that I heard about that was happening in my hometown in North Carolina, right? And we don't necessarily know as well as they do. And because the group wants to work for the communities, yes. Networking, absolutely. Networking is huge. And that's huge. We talk about networking as this entity of like building social capital, right? So we're building social capital. If you don't know about community capital development, check that one out. It's good. Responsibility and ownership, dedication and commitment to the issues. I like this. The only way to ensure long-term results is to involve the community. Community members must be on board to support solutions. Amen. And it's really, really easy to forget that. It's really easy to forget that, especially when we get tied up, when we're in service, when we're working on projects, when we're feeling a little bit overwhelmed. We can get really attached to our way of thinking and what we're working on and forget that we need to include those others. Super good answers here, everybody. So you get this stuff, right? We got to work with our community members. And oftentimes we're going to do that in groups. And that requires structure and healthy dynamics and using the tools that we just went through. Okay, so I wanted to give a little bit of time. I know that was a ton of information, but just to see if anybody has questions. And if you do have questions, you're welcome to unmute or use the chat box. If there's anything specific that you want to ask or something that you are working on that you're curious about that might fall into some of what we covered today. Just chill here. This gorgeous picture of Montana State University. I'm coming at you from MSU campus today, by the way. I don't normally have this white wall with this blue picture of Bobcat Stadium, if anybody was wondering. I love it. Yes. At the beginning, you said we should make sure we do step 1 and 2. Thank you. So the community building life cycle revolves around a community need. The first step is assessing that need, right? So this is how we keep people from leading with solutions. If I say, I'm here to work on housing issues in the community of Bozeman, well, then I need to go look at the data and say, okay, what's the gap? How does that compare against national averages? What's the experience that community members are having? What populations are being affected disproportionately, right? Like, so assessing that need to make sure that it actually is a need and that anything we design, develop is going to be targeted towards the specific need. Okay, so that's step 1, is completing a needs assessment. Step 2 is doing outreach, right? And letting people know that the problem exists. A lot of times we jump straight from, well, here's the need, I've got data, and I'm just going to start working on it. But we actually have to raise awareness within the community about the issue at hand. One of my favorite examples of that years ago, when I was a VISTA leader, actually, I was a VISTA and a VISTA leader, we had a member in Eastern Montana that was working on a teen pregnancy prevention program. And she went out there and through no fault of her own, just started programs, right? Like, well, teen pregnancy is a problem in this community, and so we're just going to do the programs. And people weren't showing up for the programs. The community wasn't bought in. She wasn't able to get, in contact with young girls who maybe could have benefited. So she went back, she pulled the data, and she brought it to the community, right, to raise awareness. And what she found was that the community didn't view that as a problem. They were like, well, girls been getting pregnant out here in Eastern Montana for generations. It's just how we do, right? So what she found is that what she actually needed to do was to raise awareness around what happens to young women when they get pregnant and the types of ways, how that affects their lives long term. So you had to raise that awareness before she could do programs. So step 1, needs assessment. Step 2, raising awareness. Step 3, pulling together your advisory council. So when the need's clear and you've raised awareness, the people who need to be involved in your work should be pretty clear. Great question. Thank you. How often is one VISTA involved in organizing an advisory group? Oh, good question. I can't say how often it is. People do, VISTAs are involved in working on advisory groups a good bit. I would say the best way a VISTA can be involved in creating an advisory group is to build a structure. That's something that's going to be sustaining long past you. That's something that you have margin, that's capacity building to say, here's the handbook, here's the position description, here's a matrix of who we need. The thing that you want to be careful as a VISTA is that you're not the point person for the advisory council and that you're not the person that's always facilitating them, because it becomes really easy for those folks to see you as the organization when in fact you're just a VISTA. Great question. And I know there was one, hold on, that got lost up here. Oh, Claire, you want to know my favorite icebreakers for boards of directors? Totally depends on your board. But I think sometimes it can just be something as silly, or is everybody seeing that, Mandy, that my battery's low? Mandy's across the way. My battery just gave me a weird message. As long as you're not seeing it, it's fine. We'll roll. Boards of directors, I think sometimes just the silly questions, right? Like high, lows, fist of thorns, you know, what's happening today. Sometimes cutting out pictures from magazine and throwing it in the middle of the table. It's like, pick that one up, tell us about how it represents you in this board. But with boards, depending on who they are, oftentimes I'll keep them seated and not make them get up and get blindfolded and play with balloons. Many of you out there will only time you will be doing balloons and blindfolds with me. Let's see. Hold on, sorry folks. What are your tips for someone who may not have authority with a particular need and to lead from the ground up? That's a complicated question. What I will say is that I would encourage you to be looking at the field of facilitative leadership and recognizing that facilitation, while often restricted to simply what we do in front of a room, is actually a lot more about leading with process and leading without taking control. And so I think it's, to me, when we operate as facilitators, whether that's in front of a room, one-on-one, in our work, it allows us to create influence without taking leadership and without taking control. It's a whole other webinar, but if you're not familiar with the field of facilitative leadership, if you haven't looked at those resources, I would direct you there. Okay, any other questions? We're rounding, play it, heading home. Okay, oh, somebody's whispering. We'll see. That's weird, right? That you know that I know someone's whispering? Hold on a second. I feel like you should just tell me. All right. Wait, where did it go? Oh, Claire, what's the name of the water dash model? The waterline. Waterline model, and it's a gem, and it's like I don't understand why we're not all teaching the waterline model and using it. So the waterline model, and if you want more information on that, any of you, I'll have my email address up here in a second, and you're welcome to reach out and I can send you stuff. Waterline. Oh, tips for vistas who may be considered outsiders to the community. You are outsiders to the community, so let's start there and not pretend that that's not exactly what's going on. I know you guys, most of you are early into your term of service, and so my big piece of advice on that is just to remember that you are in your community entry right now. And when we're conducting community entry, our job is to listen and observe with curiosity, ask questions, see what the relationships are like, figure out structures, understand historical context. It can feel like, because it's only a year and most of you probably came in super fired up to like get here and get things done for America, you know, to say, hey, slow your roll and be patient is hard advice to hear, but that will bear better fruit for you down the road than getting too worked up right now and trying to accomplish things. You can fall into the trap of thinking you know better than the community when we start getting urgent and want to do before we fully enter. So my tip is to conduct your community entry with curiosity and be patient, and know that when time comes, when you're ready and when everything aligns, like, you will have a big impact, but it's going to be a little bit of a shooting star. It's going to come fast, it's going to burn bright, and the next thing you know, you're going to be going, what the heck am I doing after Vista? So be patient right now, be curious. Great question. Can you email us these slides? Yes, I believe that Ms. Callie Foster already has those, and you'll get a recording. And my request, I'm super generous with slides and curriculum, and so I just ask that you don't go make money on them. Thank you for that. Every now and again that happens. I'm like, wait a second, that's my slides. So please use them however you'd like to, but don't go make money with my slides. Okay. So we're running out of time, and my computer says my battery's about to die, because that's just how today's going, folks. So I want to make mention of, ooh, it just Yes, technical glitches, we can still do it. So luckily we were getting to the end of the PowerPoint, and so no need to see those screens. But what I did want to share with you folks, there's an amazing resource called the Community Building Toolbox that comes through the Kansas University Work Group for Health and Human Development. You guys, it is the richest resource I ever experienced is tremendous. That will be on the link of the slide, so you'll be able to find it. But I would encourage you to look into that. There's so much information in data that you can use for that. So that's what I was going to say. Callie will send out the PowerPoint. My contact information's on there. Feel free to shoot me an email if you have questions or want additional information about anything that we've covered. But I think that we'll call this good. Callie, do you have anything else? Callie? Claire? Am I clear? Claire, Callie? All right, cool. Well, Callie, I don't know what happened to Callie, but I will sign off then for Montana Campus Compact. Thank you, everybody, for dealing with the fire hose. I hope it's been somewhat helpful. This angle of me is super weird. It has to be so weird for you guys, too. But good luck in your service. Hope to see many of you at the symposium or out there on the scenic byways of Montana. Good luck. Bye. Thanks. Just